This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast is, well, I'm here to talk of the stories of movies. The title does sort of give it away, doesn't it? I talk about production stories, development stories, behind-the-scenes stories, just those little tales that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The movies I tend to pick for this podcast have a mainstream leaning as a rule to them. They tend to be films I'm pretty much invested in. I always kind of think lots of people tell the stories of films like Lawrence of Arabia and The Godfather, but who's telling the stories of films like Turner and Hooch? Well, the answer to that is me. I did that in a previous podcast, although I'm doing two very different stories for this week's episode of Film Stories. Without further ado, I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer of the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode, and I'll pick up the story the other side of that.
I was paged last night. Came from your dad's office at the arcade. So? The number's been disconnected for 20 years. 2 nights before he disappeared, he came to my house. He said he was about to change everything. Science, medicine, religion. He wouldn't have left that, Sam. He wouldn't have left you.
Alan, you're acting like I'm gonna find him sitting there working. Just, hey kiddo, lost track of time.
Wouldn't that be something?
It certainly was something. It was Tron Legacy from 2010, directed by Joseph Kosinski. The screenplay for this one credited in the end to Edward Kitsis and Adam Horowitz from their story, along with Brian Klugman and Lee Sternthal, based on characters created by Steven Lisberger and Bonnie McBird. The cast of the film, led by Jeff Bridges, Garrett Hedlund, Olivia Wilde, Bruce Boxleitner and Beau Garrett, with Michael Sheen in there as well. You can never forget a bit of Michael Sheen. Now, the story of this one, of course, goes back to 1982's groundbreaking original film, Tron, written and directed by Steven Lisberger, again working with Bonnie McBird on the story for the movie. But after it was released, whilst it caused a stir, it didn't initially cause a sensation. That the movie did modest box office, and whilst it would be talked about continually because of its groundbreaking computer work, the first computer animated based movie, there wasn't a huge compulsion to follow it up from a commercial point of view. However, the influence, the impact of Tron continued to resonate, and also it was a film that stuck around, that it built up a growing following, and to the point where by 1999 the rumour was that Pixar, then quite early in its feature filmmaking work, that it had done Toy Story and A Bug's Life and was in the midst of work on Toy Story 2 at this point. Well, it was bursting through, and a rumour sprung up in 1999 that the studio was considering making some kind of remake or follow-up to the original Tron. Now, this was a slightly different Pixar. It was still run by John Lasseter, who was directing Toy Story 2 at that point, and he'd always cited Tron as a big influence on his work. But for whatever reason, Pixar wasn't owned by Disney at this point, although Disney was a stakeholder in the company. Whatever reason, in 1999, Pixar's plans for Tron, whether they were rumour or based to some degree on fact, they never led anywhere. But Tron work kept on going. In 2003, a video game, Tron 2.0, followed, and that again just exposed Disney Disney executives to the sheer amount of fan enthusiasm for the Tron property, for that original film. And so conversations continued. It began exploring the idea of a second Tron feature film. I mean, by this point, over 20 years past the release of the original. And so in 2005, it was revealed that it had hired Brian Klugman and Lee Sternthal to pen a script for a new film. Now, at that point, they'd written Warrior, and they were also working on, get this, a film of Black Cat that Eraser director Chuck Russell at that point was set to direct. That film ultimately went nowhere. And ultimately, too, Klugman and Sternthal's script, well, it wasn't enough to get the film over the line, but clearly it was enough to keep interest bubbling along. If there was ultimately a pivotal turning point for the project, though, it would only be a couple of years afterwards. That in 2007, and this was reported in an interview with Post magazine at the time, a meeting took place between a film director by the name of Joseph Kosinski and producer Sean Bailey, who was working with Disney, but at this point, from what I can work out, was not an executive at Disney. He now is quite senior within the company. And Kosinski at this point had made some very well received commercials and was also developing a feature film of his own in 2005, just as those stories I talked about of a Tron sequel started to spike. He was writing the script and working on a script for the film that would ultimately become Oblivion, starring Tom Cruise. That film is a whole other story in itself. I will briefly mention it a little bit later on. But Kosinski went into this meeting with Sean Bailey and he pitched the idea of making a Tron film in the world post The Matrix, that The Matrix had really been quite pivotal and impactful in the world of Hollywood visual effects. And so what he was looking to do was to take that into account, to use all the advances in visual effects, but also retain the look of the original Tron film. He wanted the idea of being able to take a camera and basically put it into that Tron world. Now, Bailey, crucially, really liked this idea and agreed to take it to Disney, but it was a pretty far out idea at that point. Certainly technologically, it was going to be an enormous leap, and it was clear that for Tron to be at the cutting edge of the digital world, as it would need to be for this film, not least just to cut through in the crowded film market at that point, it was going to need some some groundbreaking work to be done on it. So what happened after a bit of toing and froing? Disney agreed to fund a 3-minute proof of concept visual effects reel that also had a couple of story elements to it, but mainly also established the tone of what they were looking to do with the film. So at this point, visual effects supervisor Eric Barber, who was just about to start working on David Fincher's The Curious Case of Benjamin Button film, and that movie is going to come back up in this story. Well, he'd been working with Kosinski on some of the advert work that he'd done. They'd done the advert for the Xbox game Gears of War, and that had gone down particularly well. And so Kosinski and Barber went away and they came up with this 3-minute proof of concept reel, this sneak peek really at what the film could be. And it would be fair to say that 3 minutes of work went down really rather well. So this is 2007 that the original meeting took place. So let's just say that reel was done probably by the start of 2008. But what really turned the project, because Disney was still unsure, this was going to be very expensive. This is Disney pre its Marvel and Star Wars acquisitions. It had only just got into the Pixar business and bought its stake in Pixar at this point, so it was nowhere near the regular juggernaut maker that it was at this point. And so what turned it, though, was Disney decided to show the sizzle reel that had been produced at that year's San Diego Comic-Con. Now, it's worth noting that at this point, when that sizzle reel was shown at Comic-Con, the studio hadn't 100% decided to greenlight the film. Not that the crowd at Comic-Con necessarily realised that Jeff Bridges from the original film, of course, he appeared as part and parcel of this. The film at that point was called Tron 2, but one of those beautifully creative things, not where the 0 is turned into a 2, so it doesn't look like any kind of proper word, but let's gloss over that. And the 3-minute sizzle reel played in Hall H at San Diego Comic-Con, and as Sean Bailey would say in a subsequent interview with CNN, we knew that the crowd in Hall H would tell us almost instantaneously if there was an appetite for this film. And he went on to say, using a bit of posh people buzzwords, the influentials in San Diego can generate global buzz, and we've been fortunate that they have embraced our project. And boy, did they embrace the project. The response to the sizzle reel was ecstatic, but also the assumption was pretty much instant that Disney was making another Tron film. It wasn't seen at this point that it had not greenlit the film, but that was the position it was in, and it was the response from Comic-Con that ultimately persuaded Disney that this should be a go project. As it would turn out, San Diego Comic-Con would be crucial to the ongoing production and promotion of the film that would become Tron Legacy. It didn't have its name at this point, in that this would be a film that would come back to Hall H for 3 consecutive Comic-Cons. I don't think films have really done that since. There may be 1 or 2 examples. I know Batman vs Superman showcased footage a long way in advance, but really in a couple of ways, Tron Legacy was a bit of a groundbreaker at this point. So with the test material going down a treat, Disney saying yes, then there was the case of how is the film going to come back together. So the writers Edward Kitsis and Adam Horowitz were two huge Tron fans, and they'd been working on the TV series Lost, and they were recruited by Sean Bailey to come up with the working screenplay for the movie. Now, by this point, they could work. One of the advantages of that sizzle reel was that it could show the eventual writers of the film, and the sizzle reel was done before writers were on board, the tone that the film was going to go for, and they could work within those parameters. But what happened is Kitsis, Horowitz, Sean Bailey and Joseph Kosinski, who at this point had signed on to direct the film off the back of his pitch and off the back of that sizzle reel, they went away for 48 hours. They went to Palm Springs, locked themselves away, they switched their phones off, they went away from the internet, and they spent 48 hours breaking the story and working out exactly what the narrative of Tron Legacy was going to be. They tuned the outline, they worked out the shape of the film. They did put together something that originally didn't involve the original film's Bruce Bottleitner, but a quick fan backlash would ultimately put pay to that. And the challenges at this point then started to present themselves. A sizable one, for instance, being how to present a de-aged Jeff Bridges in the film. And I won't go into plot details of how and why, short of the fact that they needed to do some pretty groundbreaking work long before The Irishman came along with the presentation of human beings in the movie, and in particular making them look younger. And in fact, in the case of Jeff Bridges, what they used was the look of him from one of his earlier films, Against All Odds. But this was where the Curious Case of Benjamin Button came in again. That David Fincher was working on that film, which basically takes, if you don't know, Brad Pitt in that movie goes from very old to very young, and thus there's significant aging work and aging technology that's done within that movie. And Fincher generously shared the details of just how they were doing it, that Kosinski could go in and have a look at the groundbreaking work they were doing on that movie, and it would prove to be a pivotal movie in the development and even the existence of Tron Legacy. That Kosinski would ultimately hire the Benjamin Button team that had done so much of the pathfinding that needed doing, and he would go on to say he couldn't have achieved the look of Tron Legacy had Benjamin Button not happened. Now, we're at the point where the film gets the green light 2.5 years before its release, and it's a huge deal for another reason as well, that Joseph Kosinski was at this point a first-time movie director, and a first-time movie director had never in history been given a $170 million budget to make their first movie. But that is exactly what happened with this. Disney gave him the green light to basically make the most expensive film ever made by a debut director. The challenge was further heightened, though, that Disney, wanting a return on its money, knew that it needed to target 3D on this, and Avatar was spiking, of course, in 2009, which would completely change expectations of what 3D could do, both in terms of presentation on the screen and commercially at the box office. But because so many of the shots in Tron Legacy were being digitally created, what they realised is basically this was not going to be a 3D retrofit. The 3D had to be implicit within the filmmaking. So they were having to create some of those digital shots twice to get the 3D effect. This was not also, it's worth noting, a sequel that abandoned the creatives of the first movie, that even though Steven Lisberger didn't direct and took a relatively backseat when it went into production, arguing that this was one for the younger guys to go in and do, he was aboard as co-producer on the film. He was a sounding board to Joseph Kosinski and his team. And as my old colleague Ryan Lambie would interview Kosinski about the influence of Steven Lisberger, and he said, quote, he was a kind of Obi-Wan to the film. Casting wise, it's worth noting from the off again that Michael Sheen, the brilliant Michael Sheen, was and is a huge fan of the original Tron. And when Disney came to him with an offer for the movie, the story was that his agents didn't want him to snap Disney's arm off because they wanted to get his fee up. But by the sounds of it, Sheen would have done it for nothing and would have walked to the set to do it. The character of Sam Flynn, there was a point where Casey Affleck was in the running to take on that role until scheduling knocked him out, and ultimately it would be the then relatively unknown Garrett Hedlund who would take that role on. Olivia Wilde, meanwhile, came in the role of Cora, and Jeff Bridges would return to effectively complete and lead the ongoing ensemble of the movie. Now, it got to a point where the script was in place and physical production on Tron Legacy could begin, and that work began in America on the 6th of April 2009, and the actual shoot of the movie was relatively brief. It would shoot for just over 60 days. Production would wrap up on the 1st of July 2009. The following near 18 months, though, was very, very intensive post-production work. It's worth noting the post-production work being done at Digital Domain, the effects house. Daft Punk separately were working on the music in London, but this was an American-centric production. As part and parcel of that 64-day shoot, the actors were required to wear special and oftentimes very hot suits, to the point where on the set special air conditioning units were built in, and the actors would have to sit under these units just to physically be able to cool down after they'd done a take. There was, however, a little bit of course correction work on the movie as the post-production work got underway in earnest. That an early test cut of the film was put together in early 2010 ahead of planned reshoots. That built into the schedule was the chance to do some pickup work in the summer of 2010, so 6 months before the movie's release. But what Disney did here was it brought in Pixar for a bit of help. That John Lasseter, screenwriter Michael Arndt, and writer-director Brad Bird were amongst those who were shown an early version of the movie, and there were deemed to be problems with the film at that point. So some pretty extensive Goes the Story rewrite work was duly undertaken at that point, and planned reshoots did indeed go ahead in June of 2020. The extra writing was taken on by a combination of Lasseter, Arndt and Brad Bird. It was 6 days of extra filming in the end, but crucially the original screenwriters were also involved. This wasn't a case of jettisoning the talent who'd got the movie this far. There was very much a sense of using the creative brains of Pixar to enhance what was there. The film was going to be something of a tough sell. That much was clear, that Disney was banking on a lot of fan enthusiasm from the original film, but also it was needing to make, about $500 million realistically to get a return on the heavy investment for the movie. As a result, the promotional campaign was extended and expensive, that not least the three aforementioned aforementioned Comic-Con appearances just to keep building the Tron name for a new audience. I mean, most of the people involved in the making of the film were at an age where they were incredibly young when the first Tron film came out. Kaczynski and his team would give plenty of interviews while they were working in post-production at Digital Domain. They were, my former colleague Ryan Lambie went along to do some interviews there. He recalled them being a little bit nervous about the rough material at that stage, was that being shown to journalists, about 6 months before release. But also, the interviews for that film were taking place against a backdrop of the whirring of the server farm in the background that was doing the complex visual rendering work needed for the movie. Disney would very wisely tap into the internet, where a lot of fandom was of course residing, for the promotion of the film. It came up with some clever viral website work that invited people to unlock and find an assortment of sites that were put around the internet, where clues to what they were just hidden in very small print. But also it borrowed a trick from the promotion of James Cameron's Avatar movie. That Avatar at that point was the most expensive film of all time, and it was a non-franchise gamble. And as a consequence, what Fox did at that point is it did a preview of Avatar in cinemas, that you could go along to a cinema and watch, 10-15 minutes of the film to get a flavour of just what they were selling at that point. And Disney decided this would be a good idea to do a similar thing for Tron Legacy, and as a consequence, a 23-minute preview of the film was screening in cinemas 2 months before the film's release. The only thing that's really coming close to doing that now is when Christopher Nolan releases a prologue of one of his movies ahead of the release of that. But this was a very, very sizable chunk of the film that you could go along and see. It was becoming clear too at this point that the sizzle reel that had been shown was just that, a sizzle reel, and the material basically that got the film greenlit was not necessarily going to be in the final movie. Ultimately, the awareness of the film grew, that the film would be released in December 2010. In fact, the UK release in the end was brought forward a week or two just because of the chatter about the film. Disney got some confidence with the movie. That confidence was pretty well founded as well, that the reviews for the film when it premiered at the end of November 2010 and released in December 2010, the reviews were fine. I mean, they weren't great, but the visual spectacle of the film was coming in for particular praise. And how many films do we know have sold primarily off the back of digital spectacle and kind of got away with that? Certainly it didn't seem to be being hampered by the fact that Tron was a name that hadn't really spurred a box office huge success before, but conversely the way Disney had sold the movie had very much made it into something of a must-see film, and people did go off and see it. It fell slightly behind original opening expectations. In the US, it opened opposite Yogi Bear. Do you remember the poster for that? If you don't, go and search it and book about an hour to yourself just to go and laugh for the rest of for the rest of that time. But Tron Legacy would open to $43.6 million in the US. It would go on to make $172 million, and overseas it would do more than double that. So the total gross came in at $400 million, which was pretty decent, really. It had just also been an incredibly expensive film to market. That was the other side of it. Not only not on the cheap side to make, but actually putting it out into the world. I would imagine the investment roughly doubled as a consequence of that. So Disney wasn't going to see massive profits on this one at all, not even though it became a DVD hit as well. However, it had done enough to reawaken the Tron name and made it potentially into a viable franchise for the studio again. But this was Disney in changing times, that early 2010, it was slowly starting the shift towards its new strategy of fewer movies and bigger movies, that whilst it still had films like John Carter and Tomorrowland that were going through the process, it at this point had also acquired a company by the name of Marvel. Who knows? You might have heard of them. So Disney announced its purchase of Marvel in 2009, and so at that point its movie division was looking to end the deal that Marvel had with Paramount for distribution of the movies and bring them all under the Disney banner. Now, against this backdrop, background, a Tron 3, the possibility of a Tron 3, well, that was on the desks of Disney executives, but the question was it going to be worth the gamble? Was the $400 million that Tron Legacy made when Disney had thrown everything at it about the height of this? Was that as big as it could go? And so, whilst Tron 3 was still a possible, news was really pretty much light that whilst there was talk of a sequel around the release of Legacy, it wasn't until early 2015 that news finally broke that Tron 3 was going ahead. But then, I mean, this was in March 2015, but then within 2 months, it was all cancelled again. And Disney had apparently at that point decided to put Tron 3 in turnaround, and it was going more down its Marvel strategy at that point, as well as fewer big tentpole movies. I would imagine also the success of Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland film also turned heads within Disney an awful lot. In the aftermath of Tron Legacy, Joseph Kosinski would go on to make Oblivion, and he was also heavily linked with a remake, reboot, whatever, of The Black Hole. But in fact, in the end, after he did Oblivion, he'd step away from science fiction altogether to make Only the Brave. And more recently, he's now in post-production on the upcoming summer blockbuster Top Gun Maverick. That didn't end things for Tron, though, because in 2017, Jared Leto's name suddenly cropped up as linked to a new Tron movie, that Tron 3 may be going ahead, or a reboot or something like that. But then again, that talk petered out. Then Disney Plus was toying with a TV series, and there's been a couple of options for a TV series around Tron. That petered out as well. And the simple truth now looks like Tron Legacy might be all we're getting. And if it is, I mean, it's a dramatic and very ambitious and groundbreaking in many ways sequel. And I think it's probably the last time that Disney will spend a 9-figure sum on bringing back a film that a film franchise, really, or making a franchise out of a movie that had been released over 20 years before. Which brings us to the halfway point of this Film Stories episode. So, a couple of small favours, if you don't mind. I am an independent podcasty person. As a consequence, I rely pretty much entirely on your word of mouth to get the word of the Film Stories out. If you would be kind enough to subscribe to this podcast, that helps enormously. Likewise, if you can leave a positive review at your podcast repository of choice, that also helps enormously as well. Film Stories, we also produce print magazines, the latest of which is Film Stories Junior Issue 3, which is our print magazine for young film fans. But you can find all about the magazines at www.filmstories.co.uk. And the week this podcast is going out, we're also about to drop details of the next issue of our monthly magazine as well. Hooray! Right, let me crack on though with the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm coming back to Britain, and I'm still in the same decade, still in the 2010s. Here's a clip.
That was soft rock cocaine enthusiast Fleetwood Mac, and this was Alan Partridge. Love that noise. I was having a fascinating conversation with Norfolk's most sun-tanned child, just passed his details on to the social services. Alan, we've been taken over. So, Pat, no one's getting sacked. Just sack Pat.
Just gave me 30 minutes to clear out my locker.
That was then a snippet of the trailer for 2013's Alan Partridge, Alpha Papa, directed by Declan Lowney. Writing credits for this one, Neil Gibbons, Rob Gibbons, Steve Coogan, Armando Iannucci and Peter Bainham came up with the screenplay for it. The cast, led by Steve Coogan as Alan Partridge, also co-starring Felicity Montague, Tim Key, Cole Meany in there as well. And this one would have quite a bumpy story behind it. So obviously the origins of it go back to the Alan Partridge radio show and TV programmes that Steve Coogan starred in and also co-created with the likes of Armando Iannucci and Peter Bainham, writing them alongside him amongst many other people. The problem at the heart of this one, and Coogan said this quite a lot, is how do you take a character who at best works in 30 minutes on television and make him work in a 90-minute movie? That after the end of the I'm Alan Partridge TV series, after two series of that Coogan was constantly being asked, when's there an Alan Partridge film coming? When's it coming? And there were points where it was in development and it was happening, and as a consequence those questions were somewhat inevitable anyway. But what Coogan did at one point, when he did make the jump into movies, first of all, he went the other way. That he did a film called The Parole Officer, one that he doesn't particularly seem to like anymore. I've always really liked and really enjoyed The Parole Officer, but there was an element of Partridge to that without actually being an Alan Partridge film. But Coogan was building his film career. He would go on to earn an Oscar nomination for Philomena, which he developed and co-wrote, and I'll be coming back to that film shortly as well. But also the question of Partridge would keep coming up. Now he talked a lot about this film in his memoir Easily Distracted. I do quote a little bit from that, and he talks quite candidly in there about just how problematic bits of getting this film together were. For instance, he talks about how he drifted a little bit from Armando Iannucci and Peter Bainham, that they'd gone off in other directions to do their own projects, and as Coogan said in his memoir, quote, "I think they were also a bit fed up with me." He's quite self-critical in his book. But the questions kept on coming. I'm Alan Partridge finished its run. Coogan was off doing other projects, and whenever he would do the interviews, he'd be asked about Partridge. And he read an article in a national newspaper at one point as to why an Alan Partridge film would never work, and this got under his skin a little bit by the sounds of it. So we got to 2004, and the news broke for the first time really that a Partridge movie was pressing ahead. It's late 2004. There was an American studio that was looking to back it and make it at that point, and the whole idea was to take Alan Partridge out into the world. And Patrick Marber, who'd worked on early Partridge and now famous playwright of course, was working on a screenplay for the film. And so Bainham and Coogan went to Los Angeles to try and secure funding, and the plan at this point was for a film that would have seen an Al-Qaeda siege of the BBC, with Alan Partridge then coming in as chief negotiator. And one idea was he's asked by the terrorists which hostage they should shoot. But the pitch wasn't really working. Fox Searchlight was interested to a point. They expressed some interest. Another studio claimed to be interested in Partridge, but as Coogan recalled in his memoir, they were sat there with a printed out sheet of his IMDb credits when he went into the meeting. But the suggestion was still in 2005 this was going to happen, and several factors in the end derailed that, not least the terrorist atrocities in London that took place in July 2005, and it was not unsurprisingly believed that it would be quite insensitive and wrong then to press ahead with the plan for the story of the movie. Further ideas were explored. There was a problem in that a film such as Borat had taken the idea of being a duck out of water in America a little bit, and that kind of averted one or two ideas that they were potentially exploring. Around this time, Ben Stiller expressed his interest in directing the film, and that's where it was still likely to be an American project. But Stiller would give Coogan ultimately a crucial piece of advice in terms of which way to define the Partridge film, and he advised them to focus on Alan Partridge's small world. And Coogan realised he was right, and they come up with all these potential ideas that would have had Coogan in America or elsewhere in the world, but they realised they needed to bring this story back to East Anglia, that they needed to bring it back to its Norwich roots. And so what they did is they looked again at the ideas they had. They rejigged the hostage idea that had formed part of the early 2000s version, the mid 2000s version of the film, threw in a bit of Network, threw in a bit of Dog Day Afternoon, still at one point had the BBC at the heart of it, and there seemed to be the nucleus of something there. Coogan, though, was still a bit unsure as to whether he wanted to develop an Alan Partridge feature film, and it was around this time that he started working on Mid-Morning Matters. Now, this was originally part of an advertising campaign, and it was a series of 12 15-minute episodes for a popular lager that were then made available on YouTube. And this brought into the Partridge world writers Neil Gibbons and Rob Gibbons. Coogan reprised Partridge, the role of Partridge. Armando Iannucci also was one of the writers on this one, and Tim Key was also a crucial part of it. And the Mid-Morning Matters shorts were so end of 2010, but they went really very well to the point where Sky Atlantic was then interested in developing them as a television series, and it duly did. And so in the summer of 2012, Sky Atlantic did indeed broadcast a series called Alan Partridge Mid-Morning Matters Special Edition, which was brought together from those web episodes that were put together. Coogan, though, was at a point where the Partridge film was looking like it could go ahead, but also he was working on Philomena at the time, and Philomena would film at the end of 2012 through till early 2013, and he basically said at that point he was going to do Partridge after that. And the crucial contributors there, as he would acknowledge in his book, were Neil and Rob Gibbons, that they came in to do the writing with Inici and Coogan on Mid-Morning Matters, and they brought, in his view, something different to Partridge. And so a script started to come together for what would become Alan Partridge Alpha Papa. But Coogan also knew that he had to make Philomena, he had to promote that film as well, and that was taking up an awful lot of his time. There was research done, however, it's worth noting this, they went round local radio stations in the East Anglia area, and they saw things like little prompt cards defining the audience on the walls of the studios and such like, and they felt that commerce then had to be at the heart of the movie, that the idea of these small local radio stations being taken over by global conglomerates and kind of spoon feeding the audience what it had defined that it had wanted in some posh meeting somewhere, that there was something in that they could do something with. When he came to the end of Philomena, Partridge then was next, and it got to the point where if it was going to happen, it couldn't really be delayed anymore, and what would become a difficult production was soon to begin. So he came off filming Philomena on the 7th of January 2013, and then it was straight on to making Alan Partridge was going to start filming that very month. But the script was not right. Certainly Armando Iannucci wasn't particularly keen on it at that point, and he was in the US filming VP at that point, and so it had gone off in a slightly different direction to the one that he would have gone with. There was no bad blood that he wished Coogan luck with the project. Declan Lowney, the director, he came on very, very late in the day. He directed Cruise of the Gods, the excellent TV special that's well worth seeking out. But also, to give an idea of where the script was, Brendan Gleeson had been he'd been identified to play the character of Pat Farrell in the movie, a key character in the film. But Gleeson had made this conditional on rewrites, that he wanted the script improving. And Coogan duly said that these rewrites would be done. But because he was working on Philomena, those rewrites never happened. And Gleeson would ultimately call Coogan and drop out with disappointment, really, that the work hadn't been done. I think he was quite looking forward to the film. Cole Meany, the brilliant Cole Meany, agreed to take that role on, and he said in a conversation with Coogan, "I've worked with Judd Apatow, I know a bit about improv, I don't suppose there's much point in asking to see the script," to which Coogan just said, "No, there's really no point, thanks for being so understanding." Also in the cast at one point was Julia Davis, and she was cast in a small role, but she had some feedback on the script. She wanted to develop the sexuality of the character, basically, and there wasn't really room in the film to do that. And she was ultimately replaced in the movie by Anna Maxwell Martin. But Coogan goes to the point where, when he was making the film, that he was making he found himself having to make very cold, quick, creative decisions at some point. And that, by the sounds of it, was very much one of them. Now, at the point of the first week of the shoot, the script of the film clearly wasn't in a good place. That Coogan had this idea in his head that he knew it was going to be seat of his pants, which he didn't particularly like, but he wanted to be at least 2 days ahead with the material for the film. But the problem was, the crew and the cast were assembled at this point. The script wasn't there. There was this huge pressure to get going, and Coogan and his writing team would end up working very long days. That Coogan would start at 6 in the morning, and then after the day's work he would retreat with Neil and Rob Gibbons to the writing room at the end of each day, where they'd work through till about 11 o'clock midnight, and it was a very, very brutal first week. that Declan Lowney, I interviewed him around the time of the film's release, he admitted that within days Coogan wasn't really happy with the stuff that they were getting. It wasn't clicking. Neil and Rob Gibbons were, as the story goes, on the verge of just walking out. They were just being driven that hard to try and get this right. It was around the third day, though, that it started to click. And then a week into filming, finally, some of the funny material was landing. That daily footage was being sent to Armando Iannucci on the other side of the Atlantic, and he was sending back positive notes that they were starting to turn this and they were starting to get something, and it was finally starting to work. They did have a lot of material to play with, though. Declan Lowney would tell me around the time of the film's release that the script was 155 pages at one point, and it was a meritocracy. The best stuff stayed in the film, the weak stuff went. And so he talked about how they would write 10 gags and only 4 of them would make it into the film. And he also said that oftentimes you can tell when you're shooting stuff that something's not going to work in a film, that it's not going to survive or it goes too off story. And as a consequence of all of this, there was an awful lot of stuff that was ultimately deleted from the film. That the first cut of the movie that would come in was 2 hours 45 minutes, significantly longer than the final released film, which came in at a far more modest 90 minutes long. The cuts that were made basically took out anything that didn't directly deal with Alan Partridge. So there's a subplot that was missing that was cut out of the film, where the character of Lynn, played by the brilliant Felicity Montague, had got another job with someone else that she'd met, and so you knew at that point she'd gone out of his life. Then she heard him on the radio and raced back, and all of those bits and bobs were taken out. There was a subplot with the police, a romance was in there as well, but it was just pared down to being far more about Partridge. It was a very intense and cold 30-day shoot. Primarily the film was made in and around East Anglia as well, and Coogan would occasionally stop filming for an hour just so a scene could be rewritten, and Lowney would say very little of what we originally started out with made it to the screen. It was said to be quite a fluid process. But when the film went into post-production, clearly there was about 3-4 months to get this into some kind of shape, and Armando Iannucci was back in the UK, and he came in and apparently helped enormously with the edit of the movie and get it into the final form that we ultimately saw. The film was duly scheduled for release in the UK on the 7th of August 2013, but ahead of that there was the small matter of the film's premiere, and this is where the film's distributor, Studio Canal, played something of a blinder on this one, in that a campaign came up by the name of Anglia Square Not Leicester Square, which meant ultimately, and it all perfectly programmed, the world premiere of what was known then as Alan Partridge Alpha Papa took place in Norwich on the 24th of July 2013. But also on the same day, the premiere of the film in London also took place. That Coogan went along as Partridge to the Norwich premiere and then jumped in a helicopter and was off to Leicester Square for the glitzy London gathering as well. I'm not suggesting for a minute the Norwich gathering was not glitzy. Lovely part of the world. The film ultimately to make would cost, well, it would cost £4 million to put together, with obviously release and marketing costs on top. The critical response to the movie was good to very good, really, that it was felt that they'd come up with a way to bring Partridge from the small screen to the big screen, and crucially to bridge that 30-minute to 90-minute gap for the movie. There's still a feeling, I don't think it's going out massively on a limb to suggest that Partridge still feels more in his natural home on radio and on the small screen, as the subsequent television series has demonstrated. But nonetheless, this was a successful film, both critically and commercially. Ben Stiller, you might remember earlier in this story, had offered to direct the film, and at the point the film was released, apparently he sent an email to Coogan saying, I guess I'm not directing it yet. The movie opened well. It opened to just over £2 million in the UK. It was up against Grown Ups 2, that modern day comedy classic. Oh, bit of snark there. I don't usually do snark. There you go. Have a minor amount of snark. I think Grown Ups 2 is a terrible film. It was also up against Percy Jackson's Sea of Monsters, and it prevailed over both of them. But perhaps inevitably the vast majority of its takings came from the UK, that it would ultimately make over £6 million in the UK. But Partridge really wasn't the kind of film that was ever going to massively travel travel overseas, and as a consequence it didn't massively travel overseas. There was some negligible income outside of the UK and Ireland, but that was pretty much it. However, it was all deemed a success, and in the midst of a very taxing period of his life, Coogan had scored 2 hits. Philomena had been a hit, Partridge had been a hit. As a consequence, there was the talk of another further Alan Partridge film, and that talk pretty much continues to this day, really, that there was at one point, I believe it was around 2014, so it was the year after the film came out, there was some degree of official confirmation that there were plans for another Partridge movie, but not for the first time. Those plans, the plans that had been reported, didn't really come to fruition with any speed. And at the time this has been recorded, there is no further Alan Partridge movie. Instead, what we've seen is Steve Coogan has taken Alan Partridge back to the small screen with the excellent TV show This Time with Alan Partridge, which debuted in 2019, and there is another series of that show coming to our screens as well in due course. Armando Iannucci, meanwhile, he's been off directing films such as In the Loop and The Personal History of David Copperfield. And as for Alan Partridge's career, well, there's still clearly an audience for the character. So whilst I wouldn't be one of those people to rule out a further Partridge film coming, and certainly nobody involved seems to have utterly ruled it out, the immediate future for the character does appear to be on the small screen, but also there does crucially seem to be an immediate future for the character. Which all brings me to the end of the latest episode of Film Stories, and thank you as always for listening. Just a few bits and bobs. You can be bored by me even more over at my Twitter feed at Simon Brew. You can support this podcast and the creation of a clickbait-free website at patreon.com/Simon Brew. You can find the whole Film Stories project. That's on Twitter as well, at Film Stories Pod. We have a website which is updated every weekday with loads of news and film features, and we think it's quite good, really. www.filmstories.co.uk. You can find a host of video exclusive film stories over on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/filmstories. And every now and then, well, we're known to hide out on Facebook as well and put all our stories on there. You can find us there at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. At the time this has been recorded, we have 2 live shows coming up as well in the Birmingham area. If you go to the Film Stories website and click on live events, also at the time this has been recorded, there are matters going on in the world that are meaning live events aren't happening. At the point this has been recorded, we're still going ahead. So let's see how all of that pans out. Most of all, you all look after yourselves. You all take care. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for listening. And I'll be back in another week with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye-bye.